Hello, welcome to a series of 3 podcasts which will help you to answer the questions that you can see on the screen right here. The first podcast will be about the German Crises, that's this one. The next one will be about the Hungarian Crisis or the Hungarian uprising, and then the final one will be about the Prague Spring. And really, very often, an approach you could take to the essays that you can see on the screen would be to take a paragraph each for each of those 3 crises. But there's other options as well, and we'll talk about them. What caused the uprising? Well, there's really 4 things I'm going to talk to you about here. The first thing that caused it was the actions of Walter Ulbricht in raising the individual workers' production targets by 10%. We've talked about this in class. The Soviet Union tried to impose their own version of what they thought they should be done with the economy on the Eastern European countries by getting them to adopt 5-year plans, which is a bit of a misleading title because it's more like 5-year targets without much of a plan of how to get there, which upset the workers in itself. But when they've worked exceptionally hard and actually met these incredibly high targets, it upset them further that Ulbricht raised the individual workers' production targets by 10% in 1952. Linked to this, which is the second point we're going to make here, is the farmers were threatened with the collectivization of agriculture. Now, this is another thing that they did in the Soviet Union, that they were trying to impose in the other countries in the Eastern Bloc, which is before collectivization, farmers, as they do in this country, would own their own private individual farms, work hard, sell their produce, get the profit. Collectivization is where all of the farmers have no choice but to join all of their farms together in a huge collective farm, where all the farmers work together, share their resources, share their machinery, and the idea is that would make more agriculture be produced. But in actual fact, in practice, although it sounds like maybe a good idea, which communism in general kind of to me sounds like a good idea, but in practice doesn't really work, collectivization's a very good example of this, because when the Germans were actually collectivized, which comes later on, it led to a massive drop in the production of agriculture, or in the amounts produced. And it was the same in the Soviet Union. Collectivization didn't really work. Now, in 1952-53, they were threatened with it, and it didn't actually happen. But the threat itself caused a lot of unhappiness. The third thing is there was the arrest of leading non-communist politicians. So when the workers had their production targets raised, and when the farmers were threatened with collectivization, they started to grumblings. People were unhappy with what was going on, and so non-communist politicians, well, they kind of championed that cause, and the result of that was they were arrested for no really good reason, for trumped up charges, things that were made up or exaggerated, and that really upset the people. And it seemed like East Germany was on the brink of an uprising. So Moscow got Ulbricht to come to Moscow, and they said, can you be a bit more conciliatory? Just calm it down a bit. But Ulbricht, although he wouldn't have gone, no, I'm not doing that, he sort of said, yep, okay, I agreed to it. Then he went back to Germany and still kept the targets high. So those are the 4 causes. On the 16th of June 1953, the uprising began. And it wasn't just in Berlin, it spread all across the country. On the 17th of June, the USSR's tanks rolled in to try and deal with it all. Now, it wasn't like things were dealt with immediately. Sporadic demonstrations and riots continued all summer, and the end result was that 125 Germans were killed and many more were injured. So authority was restored by force. However, the FRG, West Germany, was admitted to NATO and rearmed in 1955, which is something that the East really didn't want. And before all of this, they'd seemingly been working towards a possible reunification of Germany as part of what is the policy of d'entente, which you'll see appearing on the screen here, we've talked about in class. There were proposals before this whole uprising happened from the USSR, which was sent to Britain, France and the USA. The proposals were for German unity, with politicians from both East and West joining together to make sort of a coalition government and the removal of foreign troops. This proposal was sent in early 1953. And after the uprising, there was no chance of that. It also, although it led to the West Germans being admitted into NATO and rearmed in 1955, it did also lead to the formation of the Warsaw Pact, which was kind of contradictory to that policy of d'entente of trying to let things calm down a little bit and don't keep spending all this money on weaponry and keep the tension. I do the opposite of that. Well, the East German uprising kind of went against that whole policy of d'entente. How well did the Soviets deal with this? Well, it's a kind of running theme, as you'll see through these podcasts. The only way that the Soviets could deal with it was through force. Ulbricht didn't even trust his own security forces, and so he called on the USSR to send theirs in. The force used was typically brutal and swift. It regained control of the GDR for Ulbricht, but went against this desire for d'entente from the Soviet leadership and served to further increase tensions. Perhaps most importantly, it led to greater unpopularity of the GDR and of the Soviets, which led to more migration of Germans who moved from east to west, especially of young skilled workers, and therefore it kind of helped to lead to the third German crisis in the early 1960s, which we'll look at next. Now we need to look at this third Berlin crisis, 1958 to 61, and what caused it. A number of causes we're going to look at here. Well, the first one is it was possible to migrate from the GDR to the FRG, so that is from east to west Germany, through Berlin, which was an open frontier. It means there was nothing to stop people from going from east to west Berlin. And between 1945 and 1961, an astonishing 1/6 of all of the population of East Germany moved. To stop this, there needed to be a better standard of living in the GDR. The reason they moved is because things weren't very nice in the GDR and things were quite nice in the FRG. So it's understandable. So they needed to improve things in East Germany to make things a bit better so people didn't want to move. But the problem with this was lots of skilled workers had left to go to the West. So if you wanted to improve things, you needed to stop the skilled workers. It was a bit of a catch-22. To improve things, stop the skilled workers, but there's no way of stopping the skilled workers, so they keep moving to the West. And they keep moving because things aren't so great. So it's a bit of a never-ending, terrible cycle. The second thing you could think about is because of the Hungarian crisis. There was another podcast on the Hungarian crisis, which you can listen to. But the US did very little to intervene in the Hungarian crisis. And there was also something called the Suez Crisis in Egypt, when the US stopped Britain and France from taking back the Suez Canal from Egypt. So because of this, Khrushchev was overconfident. He thought he could get away with stuff. He thought his threats to the British and French during the Suez Crisis, and that crops up in the Hungary podcast, he thought his threats to them had caused the French and British and Israelis, for that matter, to abandon their campaign in Egypt. And he concluded that he must threaten the West to get his own way. This is what we'd call nuclear diplomacy. And he said, "Berlin is the testicles of the West. Every time I want to make the West scream, I squeeze on Berlin." So he thinks he can threaten his way to getting his own way, and he can maybe target Berlin as a way of doing this, because testicles and that sort of thing. Anyway, the other one is that Khrushchev wanted to stop the rearmament of the FRG, and in particular, he wanted to stop NATO from arming the West Germans with nuclear missiles. So, migration, Khrushchev's overconfidence, and Khrushchev's desire to stop the rearmament of the FRG. So, what actually happened? What did Khrushchev do to squeeze the testicles? First, he gave the West an ultimatum that a peace treaty must be signed between the FRG and the GDR, with all the other nations as well, and that Berlin must be declared a free city, and that all Western troops must leave Berlin within 6 months. Or, Khrushchev said he would sign his own peace treaty with the GDR alone, in which he'd give the GDR and Ulbricht control over the GDR, including Berlin, and give Ulbricht control of the land and air corridors. The occupying powers, you must remember, had never actually signed a peace treaty with Germany since 1945, because they just couldn't agree on one, which is why the Axis rights of the land and air corridors were still in place, even in the 50s and 60s, because they were part of the initial agreements between the Allies when they occupied Germany. And those agreements had never been changed because they didn't really get on since then. If a peace treaty was signed, then these corridors would not be part of the agreement, as Germany would be allowed to solve its own issues without occupiers. Anyway, all of this worried the West so much because it would mean giving up West Germany that they agreed to come to the negotiating table to talk about the German question. And the first time they did this was the Geneva Conference of May to August of 1959. It was quite similar to previous discussions between East and West, though. The West predictably demanded free elections, and the USSR wouldn't agree. But Khrushchev thought that his testicle squeezing had worked, because the West had at least agreed to speak to him. So he renewed his ultimatum, saying that all Western powers must leave Berlin. It sent the West into confusion and debate, and sometimes even some disagreements. Plenty of proposals were put forward from August 1959 to May 1960, including one proposal about making Europe a nuclear-free zone. So the Western Allies were in a little bit of a crisis of what to do about this whole ultimatum. But all of this changed due to U-2. No, not Bono, this U-2. It was a spy plane shot down over the USSR while spying on the USSR. And it led to Khrushchev cancelling a summit called the Paris Summit, which was being agreed so they could discuss all of this. Khrushchev was furious. But Khrushchev had a plan. Can you guess it? He wanted to squeeze the testicles of the West again. He loved to squeeze those testicles. He reissued his ultimatum, and this time he really thought the West might withdraw from West Berlin because he saw the new president, President Kennedy, as a bit of a soft touch. Khrushchev was wrong. How was he wrong? Well, the refugee crisis in Germany, or the migration crisis, should I more correctly say, got even bigger because, remember I mentioned it before in 1953, well in 1960 they actually did collectivise German farms. So lots of German farmers joined the mass exodus out of East Germany to the West. Also, the West had purposefully poured massive investment into West Berlin. So the citizens of the GDR could quite freely wander around West Berlin and see the shops full of goods and the great freedoms and the great wealth and the variety and choice that these ordinary people had, and they didn't. The West had done this purposefully to try to undermine the GDR. The millions who left completely undermined communism by doing so across the whole of Eastern Europe, showing it as unpopular. And the fact that so many of these were skilled made the issue twice as bad. In addition to this, much to Khrushchev's disappointment, Kennedy did not back down from the ultimatum. And Khrushchev was therefore left with a choice. He told all the Western powers, you must get out of West Berlin. He had to either carry through with his threat, in which case he might have risked nuclear destruction of the entire world, or he could back down and look a bit weak. Luckily for Khrushchev, he found a third option. So on August 13th, 1960, at 2 a.m., a barbed wire fence was erected all across the border between East and West Berlin, dividing families, stopping people from getting to work. All sorts of people, for example, had gone to stay with, say, their boyfriend or with their girlfriend at a house in East Germany when all of their family and everybody else was in West Germany or West Berlin. And then in the middle of the night, this barbed wire fence is put up, and in the morning they find that they're trapped on the other side. It was carnage. You've got grandparents. If you think in where you live, grandparents and relatives live in a different part of the city. So you might have the parents and the children all living in one part of Berlin and the grandparents living in another part of Berlin. When this barbed wire fence goes up, suddenly they can have no contact. What if the children were staying at the grandparents that night? All sorts of little stories like this come out from this 2 a.m. erecting of a barbed wire fence. And the West didn't really do anything about it. So a proper wall was soon built to replace the barbed wire fence. Now, how did they justify this? Well, in the GDR, the Berlin Wall was officially called the Anti-Fascist Protection Wall. Yes, that's right. They called it an anti-fascist protection wall and said that it was there to protect the East Germans from the fascists. Even though there weren't anybody who was fascist. I mean, West Germany was in control of the capitalists, not the fascists. Anyhow, it took everyone by surprise, except for Ulbricht and Khrushchev, who knew it was going to happen, and it caused increased tension in Berlin initially, but it did help Khrushchev save face and stopped him looking weak without the need for having to go to nuclear war option. What were the consequences? Well, skilled workers could no longer leave. It put the GDR on a more secure economic footing, therefore, though it never got close to catching up with West Germany in economic terms. Another consequence was the wall became a symbol of the division of Europe. Another consequence was the US, Britain and France were annoyed. They'd been promised access to East Berlin as part of those agreements we talked about as occupying powers, and the wall denied this to them. And eventually they decided to test this out. In October 1961, they sent diplomats and troops to cross over into the east, past the wall, as had been part of the agreement of the occupying powers in 1945. And it led to a really tense moment in October 1961 when Soviet tanks were put at what was called Checkpoint Charlie. It's one of the official crossing points between East and West. They put tanks at Checkpoint Charlie to block people from trying to come to the East. And so the US sent their tanks to Checkpoint Charlie. Both the Soviet tanks and the US tanks were fully armed. And they stood there facing each other down for 18 hours. After 18 hours of really tense, is this going to be World War III sort of thinking, the tanks slowly got the orders to retreat from each other, slowly 5 meters at a time. So another consequence was this big event over Checkpoint Charlie in 1961. Another consequence, in the long term, was that although there were issues occasionally every now and again over escaping GDR citizens trying to get from east to west and getting shot, the Berlin Wall actually eased tensions over Germany, and there wasn't to be another serious Berlin crisis until the wall fell in 1989. This was further helped because the world came close to nuclear annihilation when the USSR and USA confronted each other over Cuba in 1962. So they were a bit like, whoa, well, we got pretty close to nuclear destruction of the entire world, so we'll kind of calm it down here. But it was also perhaps because of this Berlin Wall. It kind of wasn't very nice, but it stopped there being confrontation between the superpowers. And yeah, there we go. They pulled away from further tensions. How did they deal with it? Well, at first it could be said that Khrushchev misjudged the situation. He thought that he could put pressure on the West to leave Berlin by giving them an ultimatum that he would sign a peace treaty with East Germany, leaving East Germany free to defend their own airspace and stop transports from the West to Berlin. He completely misjudged the situation, in part because of the Suez Crisis, which he thought his threats had solved the Suez Crisis and stopped the British, French and Israelis from taking over the whole of the Suez Canal. And he also misjudged things because of what had happened in the Hungarian crisis before this, when the US didn't get involved. And he misjudged Kennedy because he thought Kennedy would be a bit of a soft touch. He did, by his ultimatums, cause some disagreements between the Western powers because they worried about the ultimatums, but he was totally wrong in thinking that he could force the West to leave Berlin through threats. When Kennedy didn't budge, Khrushchev seemed to be faced with two choices: back down and look weak, or carry through his threat and cause a possible nuclear war. His decision to build a wall was a third option that he came up with that meant he didn't look weak, and war was avoided. As President Kennedy said, "It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." Admittedly, the wall did confirm the unpopularity of communism and the fact that it had to be upheld by force. Few people were fooled by the GDR line that the wall was there to protect its own citizens. However, ultimately the wall did stabilise the borders of the GDR and stop the brain drain of skilled workers moving to the west. It might have been expected to increase tension in Berlin, but apart from October 1961, when the USA and USSR tanks faced off against each other at Checkpoint Charlie, fully armed for 18 hours, the wall actually made confrontation between East and West in Berlin less likely. There was not to be another Berlin Crisis until 1989, which is significant because there were 3 in 12 years from 1968 to 60. It could be said out of the Hungarian, Czechoslovakian crisis and the German or Berlin crises that this was the one that the Soviets maybe dealt the best with because, well, as Kennedy said, it was a wall, it wasn't very nice, but it was better than war. And though some people died trying to escape, nobody actually died during the crisis, which is the same can't be said for in Hungary and in the Prague Spring. How was he wrong? Well, the refugee crisis in Germany, or the migration crisis, should I more correctly say, got even bigger because, remember I mentioned it before in 1953, well in 1960 they actually did collectivise German farms. So lots of German farmers joined the mass exodus out of East Germany to the west. Also, the West had purposefully poured massive investment into West Berlin. So the citizens of the GDR could quite freely wander around West Berlin and see the shops full of goods and the great freedoms and the great wealth and the variety and choice that these ordinary people had, and they didn't. The West had done this purposefully to try to undermine the GDR. The millions who left completely undermined communism by doing so across the whole of Eastern Europe, showing it as unpopular. And the fact that so many of these were skilled made the issue twice as bad. In addition to this, much to Khrushchev's disappointment, Kennedy did not back down from the ultimatum. And Khrushchev was therefore left with a choice. He told all the Western powers, you must get out of West Berlin. He had to either carry through with his threat, in which case he might have risked nuclear destruction of the entire world, or he could back down and look a bit weak. Luckily for Khrushchev, he found a third option. So on August 13th, 1960, at 2 a.m., a barbed wire fence was erected all across the border between East and West Berlin, dividing families, stopping people from getting to work. All sorts of people, for example, had gone to stay with, say, their boyfriend or with their girlfriend at a house in East Germany when all of their family and everybody else was in West Germany or West Berlin. And then in the middle of the night, this barbed wire fence is put up, and in the morning they find that they're trapped on the other side. It was carnage. You've got grandparents. If you think in where you live, grandparents and relatives live in a different part of the city. So you might have the parents and the children all living in one part of Berlin and the grandparents living in another part of Berlin. When this barbed wire fence goes up, suddenly they can have no contact. What if the children were staying at the grandparents that night? All sorts of little stories like this come out from this 2 a.m. erecting of a barbed wire fence. And the West didn't really do anything about it. So a proper wall was soon built to replace the barbed wire fence. Now, how did they justify this? Well, in the GDR, the Berlin Wall was officially called the Anti-Fascist Protection Wall. Yes, that's right. They called it an Anti-Fascist Protection Wall and said that it was there to protect these Germans from the fascists. Even though there weren't anybody who was fascist. I mean, West Germany was in control of the capitalists, not the fascists. Anyhow, it took everyone by surprise, except for Ulbricht and Khrushchev, who knew it was going to happen, and it caused increased tension in Berlin initially, but it did help Khrushchev save face and stopped him looking weak without the need for having to go to nuclear war option.